The Kraken awakes. Vasyl Ivanchuk is back in the match well and truly. He's just won the last game, a beautiful positional crush. It's now just 4-3 in the match. So Alireza's got white here. What can he do to stop the bleeding? He goes pawn to d4. Now Chucky goes e6 once again, inviting that French variation, but Alireza deviates. He goes knight to f3 here. And we had c5 now from Chucky, so he's inviting a Sicilian defence if Alireza goes e4, which he duly does. So we had this captures here, going in for the open Sicilian, and now pawn a6 played, the so-called can variation, different to the Najdorf because the pawn's on e6 and not on d6 as we see in the Najdorf. Now we had pawn c4. This is known as the Muroxy bind. So white clamps on d5, stops black playing that, looking to control the space and keep black hemmed in. So knight f6 was played, and now you want to kick on with pawn e5 if possible, but you can't do it straight away, or queen e5 check, then picks up this pawn on e5. So knight c3 here simply defends the pawn. Now we had queen c7, stopping e5, and there's lots of theory around the bishop b4 line as well. That's another way to play. So here Alireza goes pawn a3, stopping that stuff immediately. b6 from black prepares to develop. This bishop came to e3, bishop b7, and now pawn f3 defends this central pawn, and black sets up this so-called hedgehog structure with the pawns on the 6th rank here, preparing to develop the pieces behind like this, and black is going for a manoeuvring game, accepting less space but preparing to break with a pawn later on. d5 is very thematic, b5, f5, all these kinds of things can be played at the right moment. So bishop to e2 was played, bishop e7, both players castled, the rook came to c1 here, knight b to d7, and b4, Alireza takes that space. One day he might like to get this c5 break in. So the rook came to the c file, and now the knight drops back to b3. Again, a very logical move. You open up the d file here, and you also open this bishop to look at the b6 pawn. Sometimes the queen bounces round like this as well, sets up a battery against this pawn. There's knight a4 stuff. So there are different plans for white. Now Alireza goes for a slightly different plan. So after queen to b8 from Chucky here, he goes queen d2 rather than queen e1. But if we just explain this queen b8 move a moment, looks slightly odd, but it opens up this c rook here, and it also prepares this maneuver of bishop d8, bishop c7, whereupon you'll have this battery against the h2 pawn, and you're then preparing pawn d5. And this manoeuvre is actually known as the scimitch manoeuvre, named after the grandmaster C'Chartres, who played this a lot. So queen d2 played, bishop d8. Now this rook came to the d file, pressuring this pawn. The bishop hits the defense of that pawn just in time. And now again, there are different ways for white to play, but Alireza goes bishop to f4, snuffing out any tricks along this diagonal. And now you don't want to go e5, that's positionally bad. You give up the d5 square, very good for white. And equally, knight e8 is looking pretty passive to defend this pawn. So instead, Chucky goes knight to e5. He had to do something about the attack on d6. And Alireza doesn't have to chop that one off, give up his bishop pair here, but that's what he decides to do. The pawn recaptured, and now he plays pawn to c5. This is his idea. That pawn now left the defense of the c5 square, so he can kick on, look to generate a passer. And both players are playing very quickly up until this point. They've got roughly 5 minutes each. They started with 5 plus 3 seconds, but here Chucky should have invested some time really, thought about the position. So he decided to close things with pawn b5, but better would have been takes here. Although the knight comes in, at least you can now get pawn a5, and you'll soon be liquidating here, and then you can look to play against that pawn as a weakness. White would argue it's an asset as a passed pawn. Okay, it's double-edged and dynamic. What Chucky does is close the position with b5, but this is risky because this bishop could become a big problem, getting entombed if black isn't careful. Now we had pawn a4, and this is the brilliant follow-up from Alireza. He wants to fix this one as a weakness that he can then attack. And so best here would have been just taking really. The knight could recapture, and although white is coming into some squares here, you can go bishop to c6, get some play coming into here or b5, get some kind of blockade going. But what we had in the game was rook coming to the d file, queen e3, and now bishop to c6. It allowed the exchange here, and now this bishop's looking really miserable, as we can see. So a very passive position for Chucky. He has to try and get something going on the king side. So g3 was played by Alireza, anticipating this kind of maneuver from the knight, and now pawn h5 came. There's something to bite on here. We had rook takes on d8, and now this rook came to the d file after that exchange. Alireza is happy to exchange off these rooks, because after this pawn advances, the bishop can come back to e2, retarget this pawn. White's still doing very well, even with the rooks off the board. So the pawn captured here. After the recaptures, black has something to aim at. Knight h5 was played, but king g2 defends adequately. And now here, black's main chance to try and generate counterplay would have been queen to e8. Just try and bring that queen around to the danger zone. Say, for example, white starts targeting that pawn for a third time here. Well, now you can do stuff like pawn to f5. You're bringing the queen in here. You're shaking it up against the king. Very tricky stuff. But what Chucky did was bishop to d8 here. Looking to bounce this one round, but it's just a bit slow. This queen is too passive. So Alireza went queen d3. He targets this pawn for a third time. Also hits the bishop. Now Chucky had an interesting move here of bishop to h4. You can't capture this one, or you run into this check, losing your queen. But what you could do here as white is queen to d6, ignoring that attack, hitting the queen, hitting the bishop. So this one's basically forced. After recaptures, then yes, you lose a pawn here, but after captures on b5, these passes are looking dangerous for white. So this is perhaps why Chucky rejected it. He maybe didn't even see it as well. He's getting very low on time here. So after queen d3, he went bishop e7, but the bishop's now left the a5 square. So Alireza jumps in, the bishop drops back, and now he picks up on b5. Look at these pawns. This is really tough for black now. So g6 was played, just holds the knight. There's not so much Chucky can do now. He's getting very low on time. The pawn came to c6, c7's coming very fast, and here was Chucky's last chance. If he took on g3, this is really interesting. Now pawn c7 is best, but if you take that knight, you can actually go queen to b6, and you're threatening to start checking here. So if the king drops back, you can then take on b4 with the bishop. Now this knight is hit, so it would have to drop back to say b3. If you come to c4, the queen can pick up here. And now this move is the follow-up, bishop to e1. You can start checking here. White actually has to give a piece to cover the square. You can go bishop takes on c6. I know this is all fantasy variation. I just thought it was fascinating that Chucky did actually have some options here to crash through on g3, mix up the position. It's amazing how you can turn around even a one position. But coming back here, he didn't take on g3. He went knight to f6, and now simply queen c4, king g7, pawn c7 were the final moves of the game. Chucky resigned, it's completely gone. So Alireza takes a point back. Can Chucky fight back from here? I hope you enjoyed this video. Do subscribe to never miss another, and see the whole playlist and my Magnus one, click here. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.